A Boeing 747 is accelerating down a wet and misty runway. A typhoon is closing in on the airport and the pilots are struggling to maintain descent line in the gale force winds. Suddenly, from out of the mist, to their horror, they start to see the outlines of barriers, halls and construction equipment. How is this possible? Stay tuned. A huge thank you to Blinkist for sponsoring this video. The story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006 is really uncomfortable to tell as a pilot. The reason for that is because it shows that even really well-trained, good pilots can make some very human mistakes due to very mundane circumstances. If they don't catch that, even the smallest lapse of situational awareness can lead to some truly horrific outcomes. In the afternoon of the 30th of October the year 2000, a flight crew consisting of 3 pilots met up with their 17 cabin crew colleagues to brief the first leg of a 4-leg long-haul flight combination together. The flights would take them from Singapore, which was their home base, over towards Taipei in Taiwan. Now, there are 2 airports serving the city of Taipei. In this video, I'll be referring to Taoyuan International Airport as Taipei, since it handles most of the international flights. And then from Taipei, they would fly on to Los Angeles in the United States, and then it would reverse back towards Taipei and then finally back home to Singapore. The aircraft that they were going to fly was one of Singapore Airlines' most modern aircraft, a 3.5-year-old Boeing 747-400 that, according to its tech log, was in mint condition. The captain was a 41-year-old with 11,235 hours of total time and just over 2,000 hours on the Boeing 747-400. He was known as a competent and diligent pilot, and in the 30 days prior to the accident flight, he'd flown about 79 hours, which was quite a lot, but he reported that he was feeling well rested before this first flight. He was accompanied by a 37-year-old first officer who had joined Singapore Airlines as a cadet back in 1994, and prior to that he'd been working for the Singapore Army. First officer had 2,442 hours of total time and just over 550 on the Boeing 747-400, and it had been noted during his training that he was an average to above average pilot in all areas that was checked. He also reported that he felt well rested prior to the flights. The last member of the flight crew was a 37-year-old relief pilot with 5,508 hours of total time and just over 4,500 hours on the Boeing 747, making him actually the most experienced out of all of these 3 pilots on this particular type. His training records also showed that he was an above-average pilot in all of the areas that was being checked, and all of all, this is a very experienced and competent flight crew. When they first met up, the pilots immediately got along really well, and they started talking about their pre-flight planning documentation. Because they had all seen on the news that the typhoon Chiang Kai-shek was expected to approach Taipei later on in the evening on the following day when they were supposed to leave for Los Angeles. This could potentially mean very strong winds, heavy rain and poor visibility, but the captain also noted that the expected arrival time of the typhoon into Taipei was after their scheduled departure time to Los Angeles, so he had fairly good confidence in their ability to depart on the following day. The pilots also noted in the pre-flight documentation that runway 05 right in Taipei had been closed due to groundworks in the middle, but a large part of the section both in the beginning and in the end was still being used as a taxiway. This wasn't really of any importance to the pilots because runway 05 right was a much shorter runway that was mainly used for visual arrivals, and because of that it was never really used by the Boeing 747. However, it could be used as a taxiway, so they did make a note of that. After the pilots had finished reviewing all of their paperwork, they went to brief their cabin crew and then they walked out to the aircraft. The captain decided that he was going to be pilot flying for this first flight from Singapore over to Taipei. They dispatched normally, pushed back, and then they started taxiing out following normal procedures in Singapore. That meant that once they had received their taxi clearance, they verified the taxi routes that they had previously briefed on their charts, and then they started following the green centerline taxi line lights out to the designated runway. These taxi line lights were controlled by air traffic control in Singapore, meaning that it was only the route that the aircraft had received that was actually illuminated. All other taxi line lights were shut off. This provided the least possible risk for any confusion during the taxi out, and this is what the pilots were used to doing and used to receiving. Now, that's important to remember for what's about to happen on the following day. The flight over towards Taipei was initially uneventful, but as they started picking up the weather for the approach, they realized that the typhoon was already starting to have an effect on the winds. The captain had to struggle with some quite strong crosswinds on his approach in towards Taipei, but he handled that beautifully. They touched down and then they taxied into their stand Brouwer 5 in Taipei. They normally receive that stand, and that meant that they would have a fairly short taxi route out to runway 06, which was the runway that they normally use for departure from Taipei. On the following day, the crew met up at time 21:53 to start to prepare for the flight over towards Los Angeles. They noted that the weather outside was now really poor, with strong gusty winds, heavy rain and poor visibility. And they also noted that the NOTAM about runway works being still in force on runway 05 right. They went down to the aircraft, started preparing it for departure, and once they were ready, they started boarding their 159 passengers that was due over towards Los Angeles. Once the pilots were in the cockpit and they started looking at the weather again, the captain suggested to the other pilots that maybe we should use runway 05 left instead of runway 06. The reasoning behind this was that runway 05 left was a category 2 runway, which meant that they had lower takeoff minima, and also it was wider and longer, something that they might need in order to improve their takeoff performance, especially if it turned out that the runway was contaminated with standing water. The other two pilots agreed to this, and this is a perfectly reasonable choice to make. The only downside to this was that this meant that they were now going to use a runway for departure that none of them had really used for the last 2 to 3 years, and it included a slightly more complicated taxi routing. This new taxi routing that the captain was now anticipating could also be affected by the runway works that was going on runway 05 right, so once again the crew were looking into where those were taking place and how they were going to deal with it taxi-wise. The captain now also asked the relief pilot if he could be helping them out by calculating crosswind values as they were taxiing out to make sure that they were still within legal limits to take off. At the time, there was no defined role for the relief pilot during takeoff and landing. The only reason that he was there really was to act as an extra pilot so that they could enable some extra rests during the long flight over towards Los Angeles. Of course, the relief pilot agreed to this and he started looking at the ATIS, and at the time the wind was 020 degrees, 36 knots, gusting 52 knots. He calculated that the crosswind was about 26 knots given that value, which was very close to the maximum of 30 knots that Singapore Airlines allowed them to use. Once he had finished calculating this, the relief pilot shared the values with his colleagues, and then he volunteered to go out and do the walk-around, the pre-flight inspection prior to the flight. The captain agreed to this, the relief pilot went outside, and when he came back into the cockpit after that, his shoes were absolutely soaking wet because of the standing water out on the apron. He had to ask for permission to actually take his shoes off and just sit and fly in his socks. And he had also noticed that the catering personnel was struggling to load the catering because of the very strong winds. Now, he didn't share how much water he had seen out on the apron with his colleagues because he thought that they were busy at the time. But if he would have done that, there is a possibility that that could have triggered another discussion on the flight deck. A discussion of whether or not, with that amount of standing water out on the apron, the runway might be contaminated as well. And that is important because if the runway has more than 3 millimeters of standing water on it, it is considered contaminated. And that comes with a lot of performance penalties. But also, crucially, the crosswind capability goes down from the stipulated 30 knots to 15 knots, making it potentially impossible to depart. But that discussion didn't happen. Instead, the pilots continued to set up the aircraft for departure. The crew now copied the latest ATIS information, the weather information, and that just confirmed that the weather was really poor, with heavy rain, low visibility procedures in use, and that runway 05 right was closed between November 4 and November 5 due to runway works. Having received that latest information and the amount of crosswind that they were going to have, the captain decided that he was going to be pilot flying for the departure. He would then give the approach and landing to the first officer, and the first officer was more than happy to give this takeoff to the captain. During this later part of the cockpit setup, there is a discussion going on between the flight crew members about the fact that the typhoon is now getting closer and closer, and it's likely that the longer they wait, the worse the weather will be. But having said that, there is no rush in the cockpit. Instead, the captain is actually saying on a few occasions that they should be slowing down and making sure that they do everything thoroughly because of the poor conditions. When the captain starts his departure briefing, he starts by outlining the anticipated taxi routing. And he thinks that the aircraft is going to push back from Bravo 5 and then it's going to head east towards the East Cross, going to taxi up onto runway 05 right, head towards November 7, then join up with November Papa taxiway, proceed all the way down November Papa, then turn right onto November 1 and then taxi on to holding position for runway 05 left. This meant that he once again needed to point out the runway works that was happening on runway 05 right, because that was the reason that he couldn't continue and taxi on runway 05 right all the way down to November 1. Once the briefing was complete, the crew requested their ATC departure clearance and then they completed their final flight deck preparation. At time 23:06, Singapore Airlines Flight 006 pushed back from Bravo 5. But they pushed back facing west rather than east, as they were expecting. Once all 4 engines had been successfully started and the before taxi checklist was complete, the first officer requested taxi clearance. And the taxi clearance they received was Singapore 006, taxi runway 06, runway 05 left via Sierra Sierra, West Cross and November Papa. The first officer first didn't really capture this because this was so different from the taxi routing that he was anticipating and the captain had briefed. So he asked him to repeat, and on the second attempt he got it right and he read it back. The crew now reviewed this new taxi clearance, which in all fairness was a little bit shorter than what they had originally briefed, and they started taxiing out for departure. But before we get to the story of what actually happens in this departure, I just want to share this short message. Did you know that some days I actually consume 2 to 3 books on top of being a professional pilot and a YouTuber? Yeah, just hear me out, okay? The reason for this time management miracle is today's sponsor, which is Blinkist. Now, Blinkist is a fantastic app that takes non-fictional books and titles and they distill them down to their absolute essence, their core, which they call blinks. This means that reading through a book or listening to a podcast, which they now call shortcast by the way, can take you only 15 to 20 minutes to do, which is absolutely perfect. I tend to use Blinkist when I'm out exercising, which I love doing in the morning, or when I go to the gym, or when I'm doing other things. You can use the app to filter down to specific categories that you might like, and 3 titles that I recently went through was The Flight, Atomic Habits and Off the Clock. I would definitely recommend Blinkist to anyone who has a busy schedule but still want to consume a lot of great books. And if you click on the link in the video description here below or in the comment section, you'll get 7 days free trial where you can check it out. And on top of that, 25% off the regular price. So consider supporting me by supporting my sponsor. Now back to the video. As the aircraft now started to taxi out, the captain remarked, "Ooh, a lot of rudder work needed here, man." And the relief pilot responded from the back, "Crosswind, it's coming in. The more delay we have, the worse it will get." And to that the captain responded, "Worse if we get out. If not, don't take off." And then he continued with, I'm gonna take it slowly here because otherwise we will get skid." What the relief pilot likely meant by this was that the typhoon was now getting closer, and with that would come even stronger winds and more rain. But this didn't mean that there was a feeling of rush in the cockpit. On the opposite of that, the captain actually indicated that he knew that there was a possibility that if the winds got worse, they might not be able to take off at all. And what the captain meant when he was talking about a lot of rudder work needed is the fact that when you're taxiing an aircraft in very strong winds, that wind will hit the vertical stabilizer and the rudder, which are like a giant sail. And when it does, it's going to create a force and a momentum around the yaw axis, causing the aircraft to want to weathercock in towards the wind. And the captain who's taxiing the aircraft needs to counteract this with the use of the tiller or with rudder in order to maintain the center line. And this can become really tricky the more wind you have. So it's very likely that the captain is now really concentrating on keeping this aircraft on the center line lights as he is taxiing out. As the aircraft continues down the taxiway, the visibility outside is only 400 to 500 meters and it is pouring with rain. In those kind of visibility conditions, it's likely that the captain is mainly focusing on the green centerline lights on the taxiway. As I was explaining before, in Singapore, the green taxi line lights are only illuminated in the exact routing that they will be taxiing. But in Taipei, it's slightly different. In Taipei, all green taxi line lights are illuminated at the same time. And it's up to the cockpit crew to know which turns they need to make, because all turns are illuminated. And this wasn't the only difference between Singapore and Taipei. In the accident report, it was noted that Taipei wasn't really up to scratch with some other parts of the lighting as well, including the wigwags, the runway entry lights, which were not present at the holding point for runway 05 left, and also, crucially, they did not have any active ground radar. The installation of ground radar had been requested by the airport, but due to budget constraint, it hadn't been implemented. So this meant that air traffic control could not see this aircraft once it passed more than 500 meters away from them. But the flight crew, crucially, didn't know about this. They thought that air traffic control could see them as they were taxiing down the taxiways. As they were taxiing out, the crew selected flaps 20 and started working through the before takeoff checklist. The captain asked the relief pilots to pre-check the ATIS, the weather, to make sure that they were still within crosswind limits. The relief pilot did so, and he calculated the crosswind to be about 28 knots. The ATIS did not mention anything about the state of the runway, whether it was contaminated with standing water or not. And the pilots assumed, since there was nothing mentioned on the ATIS, that the runway is probably just wet. The problem here is that while some airports out there have the equipment to go out and accurately measure the amount of water on the runway, some airports do not, and they will not report it because of that. So it's then going to be up to the pilots of arriving or departing aircraft to depart it, that they can see that the runway has standing water on it, in order for that to be promulgated on the ATIS. Or, like most airlines do, they will have a look at the type of precipitation. So, for example, if it is heavy rain and the runway is not grooved, they will assume that the runway is contaminated and work based on that. But Singapore Airlines did not do that. They needed an actual physical report from air traffic control about the contaminated runway in order to start applying contaminated runway figures. And this is likely why this wasn't even discussed in the cockpit as they were now taxiing out, even though other airlines had applied these contaminated figures to their departure calculations earlier on during the day. It is likely that with that type of really heavy rain, the runway probably was contaminated with a bit of standing water. And if they would have used those figures instead, well, then they would have had a maximum crosswind capability of 15 knots, like I mentioned before, and they would not have been able to depart. At time 23:14, the aircraft was getting close to the intersection with the November Papa taxiway where they needed to turn left. As they were turning, they were handed over from the ground controller to the tower controller, and the first officer called up the tower and got the following message. Singapore 006, good evening. Continue hold short, runway 05 left. Now, there wasn't mentioned anything about this in the final report, but when I read this, I really reacted to it personally. Because generally speaking, whenever we get a clearance towards a holding point, which requires us to cross an either active or non-active runway, that is always included in the clearance. So I would have expected them to get a clearance more like Singapore 006, good evening, continue taxi by November Papa, turn right onto November 1, cross runway 05 right, hold short runway 05 left. Because that would have included all of the different parts that they needed to taxi past, and it would also have enhanced their general situation awareness and the fact that they needed to cross one runway to reach the other. But that wasn't mentioned. They just got that one clearance that told them to taxi into holding position runway 05 left. Now, if any of the pilots would have looked out to the right as they were making the left turn onto November Papa, they would have seen the area of groundworks that was happening on the runway 05 right. Now, there was no work being done during the time that this happened, but the workers had left behind a couple of steam rollers, a couple of excavators, and some other equipment. The whole area was sealed off with concrete jersey barriers with battery-driven red obstacle lights on top. Now, they should have been sealed off with some kind of barriers of more frangible material, but because of the extreme winds that were going on, the airport had agreed to put these concrete barriers there instead, because that would pose less of a risk of things getting blown off this runway and onto the active runway, runway 05 left. Now, I want to mention here as well that the reason that there were groundworks going on runway 05 right was because that runway was being remade into a permanent taxiway. Because of this, green centerline taxi lights had been installed throughout the length of runway 05 right, and there was no crosses or any indication of a closed runway on either of the thresholds, and that was because parts of the runway was still being used as a taxiway. Back in the cockpit, the first officer tells the captain that the next one is November 1, and the captain responds with second right, and the first officer responds second right, yeah, that's right. This shows that at this point, the captain was well aware where he was on the airfield. He knew exactly where he was taxiing. At time 23:14 and 58 seconds, the captain tells the first officer to report that they're ready for departure. The first officer does so, and the tower responds with Singapore 006, runway 05 left, taxi into position and hold. This was then almost immediately followed by Singapore 006, runway 05 left, surface wind is 020 degrees 28, gusting 50, clear for takeoff. This was responded to by the first officer. The clearance was issued just as the aircraft was getting towards the end of November Papa, about to make a right turn onto November 1. And there is a possibility here that the captain, who thought that air traffic control could see them on their radar screen, issued the takeoff clearance because they saw that the aircraft was close to the threshold of the departure runway. At time 23:15 and 48 seconds, the pilots have completed the before takeoff checklist. The first officer calls out, "Okay, I have the green lights here." And the captain responds with, "It's very slippery. I'm gonna slow down a bit. Slow turn here." The aircraft initiates a continuous right-hand turn from November Papa onto November 1, where they should be continuing straight ahead for a couple of 100 meters until they get to the holding position for runway 05 left, and then line up runway 05 left. But instead of doing that, the aircraft continues its right-hand turn and starts lining up with runway 05 right instead. So why is this happening? Well, there are many reasons why we humans make mistakes, but in this case it was likely a combination of some very unfortunate factors. The captain, who is struggling to taxi his huge aircraft in the strong crosswinds, is likely concentrating a lot on the green taxi lights that he can see. And as you remember, back in Singapore, those green taxi line lights would only lead him into the correct taxi routing. But as I mentioned, in Taipei, all taxi lines are illuminated equally. But there is a small difference, because when a taxi line makes a turn, there is a smaller spacing between each individual light. So that meant that as the aircraft was now making the right-hand turn, there was only about 7.5 meters between each individual light making the turn onto runway 05 right that was being used as a taxiway at the time. But in the straight line that the aircraft should have followed, there was only 4 green lights in the entire distance over the runway, where there should have been 16 lights. And it was found that the first light in that straight line was likely not working at the time of the accident, and the second light after that was working, but at a very low intensity. And remember that the wigwags, the runway guard lights, are supposed to indicate where the holding point for the active runway is located, weren't installed either. That was another trigger that wasn't available to the crew, and all of this together meant that the captain, who is now taxiing in pouring rain and gusty winds, concentrating on following the green lights ahead of him, saw a nice line of green lights turning him onto the right that were much more conspicuous than the line that was bringing him straight ahead. And he also saw the threshold markings, the piano keys, and because he was used to the green lights always showing him the right way, this is likely why he started to make that right turn onto runway 05 right, rather than going straight ahead that his chart clearly indicated that he needed to do. The other 2 pilots likely saw the same thing as the captain did, but they were also occupied with doing other tasks. The first officer was making sure that the before takeoff checklist was completed, and the relief pilot was still calculating the crosswind figures for the departure. As the aircraft is still in the turn, lining up, the first officer says, and the PVD hasn't lined up yet. This is referring to an instrument called the Paravisual Display, which is a small instrument located in the glare shield that utilizes the localizer to show the pilots where the centerline is on the active runway to help them during low visibility departures. The relief pilot responds to this and says that no, the PVD is not available because we have more than 45 degrees still left to turn before we're on the correct runway direction. And this is true, but that's not why the PVD is not activated here. The reason the PVD is not activated is because they're on the wrong runway. At time 23:16 and 23 seconds, the captain says, "Not on yet the PVD, huh? Well, never mind, I can see the runway, okay, so it's not too bad. I'm gonna put this on high and 010 is from the left, okay?" The next thing that happens is that you can hear on the cockpit voice recorder how the windshield wipers are turned into high, and then you can hear the 4 engines revving up, stabilizing, then roaring into full takeoff thrust as the giant Boeing 747 now accelerates down the runway. So at this point, it's important to discuss why this is happening. We've already discussed why the captain might have made the initial mistake to line up on the wrong runway, but there are multiple things that should indicate to the crew that this is not the correct runway. First of all, if they would have looked down onto their primary flight display, they would have seen that the localizer that they have tuned is indicating full left, meaning that they're not on the centerline runway 05 left. Also, if they look at their navigation display, the aircraft symbol is way out on the right side of the active runway. But on top of that, they knew that they were getting onto a Category 2 runway. They had discussed that earlier in the briefing. And a Category 2 runway has very distinct lighting. The whole touchdown zone is lit up. But what they're seeing in front of them right now is just centerline lights, and those centerline lights are green. And on top of that, all 3 pilots have just discussed that the paravisual display, who's supposed to be there to guide them towards the centerline, has not activated. Well, the reason for this is likely a classical case of confirmation bias. That's when we humans have a picture in our mind that a certain scenario is happening. And instead of questioning that scenario, we're just trying to find things that confirms that the scenario we have in our heads is the correct one. And we disregard all the signs that point in the opposite. 11 seconds after the start of the takeoff roll, the first officer calls out 80 knots, the captain responds check, and at time 23, 17 and 16 seconds, the captain calls out there is something there, followed only a second later by the first sound of impact. The aircraft now impacts several concrete jersey barriers, holes in the runways, excavators and steamrollers. The impact rips off both of the engines on the left-hand side, causing asymmetric thrust, turning the aircraft to the left. As it does so, the tail of the aircraft impacts further obstacles on the runway, tearing that clear off the rest of the body. The aircraft now rotates in a counterclockwise movement before both of the wings also separate from the body, as well as the remaining engines. When it finally comes to a stop, the center part of the aircraft, where most of the fuel is located, bursts into an uncontrollable fire. Inside the aircraft, there's understandable pandemonium as this is happening. Several of the emergency exits are open, but when the cabin crew tries to inflate the slides, they realize that the strong winds outside makes it impossible for the slides to reach the ground. They're just blown up towards the side of the aircraft instead. 2 of the slides have actually been activated inside of the aircraft because of the extreme side forces as the aircraft was rotating on the ground. Out of 179 passengers on board, 83 people perish in the accident and a further 39 are severely injured. The investigation into what caused this accident started immediately, and it was helped by the fact that they could quickly locate the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder, and also by the fact that all 3 pilots survived the accident and could be interviewed afterwards. The investigation found that the accident was caused by the pilots losing situational awareness in the very end of the taxi, causing them to line up and take off on a closed runway. It was deemed that the pilots had not briefed the taxi routing as thoroughly as they should have, and they didn't make full use of all of the cockpit equipment to make sure that they were actually on the correct runway before they started the takeoff roll. Contributing factors was the really poor weather, the less than optimal airport lighting, and the fact that the typhoon was closing in, potentially causing some subtle time pressure on the pilots. As a result of this accident, there were several recommendations made, including to Taipei Airport to improve their airport lighting and to finally install the ground radar that could have potentially stopped this from happening. There was also recommendations to Singapore Airlines to train their crews on the use of the para-visual display, and also they were forced to add another before takeoff checklist item for the pilots to verify that before they started the takeoff roll they were on the correct runway. There was also a recommendation sent to Boeing to give better guidance to crew on how to operate the emergency escape slides in case the winds were higher than 25 knots, which Boeing had stipulated as the highest wind speed to operate these slides. My own personal feeling that I got when I read this report is that it shows just how easy a serious mistake can happen even to diligent, well-trained professionals. It is so important, especially during bad weather and stressful situations, that you slow things down and really concentrate on every single part of your operation. It's also important to listen to that inner voice that generally screams to you whenever there's something that you've missed or something about to go wrong. Whenever you hear that voice, just slow things down, question what is going on at that particular moment, and maybe redo the last checklist you were doing. I have actually started doing courses in leadership, decision making, among other things, where we use examples like this, we learn from them, and we also give you tools on how to avoid them, no matter what industry you're working in. If you are interested in joining one of those courses in the future, well then go to mentorpilot.com and write your name down on the emailing list. I'll send you an email whenever I do my next course. Now, check out this video next, which I think you're going to find really interesting. And I hope that you've subscribed to my new YouTube channel, Mentor Now, where I do more technical and more current topical videos. If you want to support the work that I do, then consider becoming part of my lovely Patreon family or buy yourself a t-shirt. Bye-bye.